Hi, you're watching Monday Night Live. My name is Brendan Malone, and in this episode I'm going to be speaking to David Quinn. David is the founder and director of the Iona Institute and one of Ireland's leading social and religious affairs commentators. He has been a national newspaper columnist since 1994, and he has appeared on numerous TV and radio shows and taken part in many national debates. David was editor of Ireland's main Catholic newspaper, the Irish Catholic, for almost 7 years, and he currently has a column in the Sunday Star Times. Among those he has debated in the past are Professor Richard Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens, and a collection of his columns has been published called How We Killed God and Other Tales of Modern Ireland. So without any further ado, let's have this important conversation with David Quinn. David, thanks so much for being with us here today. Tell me, something I've heard a lot about lately that's coming out of Ireland, it's a story that's been around for a few years, but it seems to have flared up again, are the accusations about Irish nuns killing babies in care homes. Can you tell us exactly what is the story there? What is the truth? Because I thought I understood this as being something where the initial accounts had been completely overinflated. It was not what people claimed. And yet for some reason, a couple of years later, we are back regurgitating this exact same story.
Yeah, well, so in the deep end. So a big, almost 3,000-page official report came out a few weeks ago about the mother and baby homes, which are run mainly by, Catholic nuns, not entirely, because some are run by Protestant organisations, and these things called county homes that are run by the state. And they were the successors to the poor houses, by the way, the workhouses that would have existed all over Britain and Ireland and maybe New Zealand once upon a time. And so these places had an unusually high infant mortality rate, even at a time when the infant mortality rate overall was high. Because, of course, if you go back to an era before the late 1940s, no vaccinations, no antibiotics. So something like diphtheria or TB or measles gets into a place, it's going to go around like wildfire, because in these congregated settings, like the nursing homes today, by the way, in COVID, once it gets in, it spreads quickly and easily from one person to another person, and no cure. So your own antibodies have to fight it. So the overall infant mortality rate up until vaccinations and antibiotics in roughly the late 40s into the 50s was high in the general community. But in these congregated settings that were often incredibly poorly resourced, it was higher still. And so over the decades in which these places operated, which is up till about properly in the 1970s, although some kept going somewhat later, about 15% of all the babies died, which totaled about 9,000. None were killed, okay? This is just total nonsense. So this thing about 800 babies in a septic tank in the west of Ireland, mother and baby home in Tuam, which is in County Galway, is just nonsense. There are babies buried in an underground chamber. We don't know how many. We don't know what that was used for. It may horribly have been once somehow connected to the sewage system in that area, and then disused after the bodies, went in. So it's still horrible, but it's not 800 babies dead as a result of neglect or deliberate murder by the nuns. Nothing like that happened.
So is this sort of just, if I'm understanding this correctly, then it is sort of an anti-Catholic cudgel, if you like, or an anti-Christian cudgel, that people are just skimming the barest of details and they're using it to try and create a false perception of what happened?
Well, when this story first emerged, I think it was in 2014, there was an instantaneous desire to believe the very worst possible version, which is the 800 babies in the septic tank, which again has turned out to be nonsense. 800 babies and infants and, children up to the age of 2 did die in that place over about a 40-year period. Almost all died again before antibiotics. By the way, very importantly, clean water literally came on tap, because before clean water, in the era of dirty water, that was an incredible transmitter of many of these diseases. So a lot of babies did die in there, and conditions were appalling. But the willingness to believe the very worst story, I mean, as bad as, I don't know if you've ever come across these fundamentalist comic books called Jack Chick comics.
Oh, yes, I know them.
Yeah, it was right up there at that level. And so this story went worldwide. And then there was a certain amount of backtracking. But then there was a willingness to believe it again, despite, as I say, no evidence that it was that bad. Although, again, these were not pretty places by any means. And you wouldn't want your baby to be going in there because, again, they were kind of like infection super spreader type places. The motivation behind this, I mean, a willingness to believe the very worst can often be anti-Catholic. These mother and baby homes, they weren't invented by Ireland. They weren't invented by the Catholic Church. Many existed in Britain. Only about 10% of those which existed in Britain were run by the Catholic Church. A similar story can be told about these mother and baby homes in Britain, probably New Zealand, Australia, Canada, the United States. They were common and widespread until essentially, by the way, the introduction of abortion, which essentially replaced the mother and baby homes.
I want to talk about abortion in Ireland in just a minute, but a lot of people, when they think of Ireland, they think of Christian Ireland. We're recording this right now. It's about a week away from St. Paddy's Day. And when people think of Ireland, think of St. Patrick driving the snakes out. Christian Ireland, Catholic Ireland. Is Catholic Ireland, is Christian Ireland a fading dream of a bygone era? Is it gone? Is it under threat? How would you describe the current state of affairs in Ireland now?
We're an increasingly secular country, sometimes a very aggressively secular country. You see, there's no question that in the years after independence, which happened in 1922, we became kind of super Catholic, so to speak. And it was a kind of authoritarian, domineering kind of Catholicism. So even if you take out the institutions like the mother and baby homes or industrial schools, and by the way, I see there were big revelations about institutional abuse in your country there quite recently, isn't that right?
That's
I think
right.
up to about 250,000
that's
people
right.
abused down the years, although very widely defined. So even if you take all that out of the picture, we definitely had an authoritarian version of Catholicism a lot of the time that was begging a rebellion. And the rebellion has now been going on for several decades, basically all of my adult life, essentially. I was in university in the 80s, and even then it was all brewing. I would have grown up in a kind of conventionally Catholic household, but not kind of piously Catholic. There were no holy pictures and so on in my house. We had no priests and nuns in the family, I mean the extended family. But by the time I went to uni, a lot of my friends had stopped going. Nobody was putting them under pressure to go. The Catholic Church was kind of disregarded. The kind of contempt that later developed when the scandals began to break hadn't really come on the scene. But you could already see that even without the scandals, Ireland was secularizing, and people had kind of grown tired of the Catholic Church. And this has continued. So when I was growing up, maybe 80 or 90% of people went to Mass each week. And that's probably down now to 25 to 30%. And they'd nearly all be retired people. I would be young, by standards of Mass goers.
Do you think that the Troubles, particularly through the 70s, 80s in Ireland, and it seems to me that there is certainly a streak of politicisation of Catholicism with the IRA and things like that, do you think they contributed to then, when the abuse crisis happened, that was just the final straw?
No, I think that had very little to do with it. I think people recognised that the IRA was not, a Catholic organisation in the proper sense. They were a nationalist organisation. And obviously in the North, the split was between, nationalists who were Catholic and then unionists who were Protestant. And that would have exacerbated tensions. But the IRA was a nationalist organisation first and foremost. It was not a Catholic organisation, even though its supporters would have come out of the Catholic community. But a lot of them would have been actually even then post-Catholic. I mean, the Republican movement in Ireland and the Catholic Church, down the centuries have actually had a very tense relationship.
The abuse scandal, that hit Ireland pretty hard, right? And if I'm understanding things, it's still... I remember when the first American scandal hit in the early 2000s, and I think we all thought it was being dealt with. And it seemed to be, as we moved in sort of around 2010 onwards, it seemed that there was positive momentum, and then all of a sudden in the last 2 years, America, Ireland, there's been a whole lot of things. It just seems that it never really was dealt with, right? Is that the Irish experience as well?
Well, I mean, I have been a journalist in Ireland because I lived for Australia and then came back to Ireland in '93. And I've been writing a national newspaper column currently in the Sunday Times since 1994. So my entire career as a kind of public commentator slash journalist has coincided with essentially the scandals. So, they erupted into public consciousness basically around 1994. And it was probably about a period of maybe 15, 16 years when they were absolutely huge, and there was one eruption of public anger and outrage after another about them. The scandals, if you look at them and look at the official reports that were produced about the scandals, and we say Dublin Diocese and Ferns Diocese in the south of the country and a few other places, in addition to the industrial schools, the actual abuses tended to happen in the 1970s through to roughly the early to mid 1980s. And then they emerged later. But a hugely disproportionate number of the actual incidents date back probably from roughly 1975 until about 1982 or 3. And it's the same in America, it's the same in Britain. That was the period when all this was at its worst. And then, of course, as these victims grow into adulthood, then they begin to tell their stories. So that's roughly from the 1990s on. And of course, once one or two people break the logjam, then many, many more people come out to tell their stories. But the church, slowly but surely began to get its house in order and began to bring in procedures that made sure this kind of thing, wouldn't happen again. Or if it did happen, the police would immediately be told, and the priest would be properly dealt with and investigated both by the civil authorities and the church authorities. And that actually was the case in the United States as well. They began to get their house in order roughly around the same time. And for example, when Pope Francis came to Ireland in 2018 for the World Meeting of Families, there was another big eruption in the United States about something called the Pennsylvania Report. And it made things ignite here again because, of course, it coincided with the Pope coming here. But if you look at the Pennsylvania report, it still confirms the worst scandals happened in that period from roughly the mid-70s to the early 80s.
I don't know what the situation is like in Ireland now, but here in New Zealand, there's data to indicate that the safest place now for a child is actually within the confines of a Catholic institution because so much has been done. Meanwhile, you look at the problem within the education sector in this country, and it seems to me it's largely unaddressed, and yet their problem is massive. But anytime you get a priest or a Christian institution that is caught up in some sort of historic abuse, it makes national headlines. The stuff going on in the education sector, it sort of comes and goes, and there's not as much fanfare about it.
You see, what I find kind of interesting is in Ireland, it's understandable that the Catholic Church, having been so dominant, would be the one that particularly goes under the spotlight. And because the Catholic Church ran so many institutions and had to care of so many children, that's why there's been a really heavy concentration of scandals within the Catholic Church, which obviously you wouldn't want in a million years. But statistically speaking, when the Catholic Church was so big in this country, you can kind of see why it became so horribly dominant in that arena and why so much anger got focused on the church. But a place like New Zealand or Australia, which as I say, you lived in for about 6.5 years, the Catholic Church, as you know, I think accounts in Australia nominally for about a quarter of people. I think roughly the same in New Zealand. And yet, the Catholic Church in both Australia and New Zealand and America, where it's also about a quarter, and in Britain, where it's only about 10%, it gets still disproportionate attention. So it's kind of curious why, even in countries where the Catholic Church has never been dominant, and in fact, where there's often been a kind of anti-Catholic atmosphere, and we're talking back to the days of Protestant dominance in those countries, why is it still the Catholic Church that gets all the attention? And I think one of the reasons is there's something about a celibate priesthood that causes annoyance. And people kind of think, well, celibacy is unnatural, so it's going to cause these horrible unnatural things like child abuse. I think that's part of what's going on. And I think the Catholic Church worldwide is still by far and away the biggest Christian church, and it's kind of in the way of some of the objectives that kind of very, liberal individualistic societies want, including things like abortion. So it's seen as the principal object to move out of the way, even in countries, again, like your country, where it's a minority. I think that's part of what's going on.
It's funny, I actually see a sort of a thread of hope in this, because I would be really worried if we were living in a culture that looked at an abuse crisis within Christianity involving Christian ministers of any stripe or flavour and said, oh, well, so what? Because that's the moment that they don't expect any better of Christian clergy. But while they still look at it, and now some people, as you say, are definitely hostile to Christianity. They're using it as an axe to grind. However, it seems that for a lot more people, they still have a sense that there should be something higher in that calling. There should be a virtue that's lived out there, and that's I see hope in the fact that they recognise that.
Yeah, I guess so. I mean, obviously they expect a higher standard. Because we set such a high standard, and also, like, something which would annoy people is you're setting this high standard, and the standard can be quite cruelly applied, and that was certainly the case in the mother and baby homes, because anybody who kind of fell foul of the moral standards of the day could get severely punished. And of course that fell disproportionately on women, because they were the ones who were obviously kind of holding the baby, as it were. And that's partly the reason why these mother and baby homes were developed. And then they see, hang on, the priests were doing what? And that causes understandable outrage. So it's a combination of, we expect more from you, but you expected more from us. And look how badly some of you failed your standards. And then there were these horrible cover-ups. So again, a lot of the public anger is understandable.
To me, it's a fascinating thing, but also an extremely, obviously the victims, first and foremost, it's just horrific what they had to endure. And then now there's a moving on, a couple of decades after, and a new generation are now actually carrying the cross of what was done by those who participated in, covered up those evils. Is that I think the ability of the Christian church to be a witness in the public square has been hampered because of a lot of this, that particular thing, the abuse crisis. We used to think of Ireland as being pro-life Ireland. I remember this. I remember giving presentations and talking about the Irish approach to abortion and really how you'd say successful it seemed to be. That has changed, though, quite dramatically in the last few years, right?
If I can just go back a step, by the way, because sometimes when I'm giving talks and the scandals obviously come up, and the alienation of the scandals are caused. A point I sometimes make is sport is bedeviled by every possible scandal you can imagine, all right? Drug abuse, betting scandals, sex abuse scandals, cover-ups, all right? Everything that human beings are capable of is there in sport. Now, I know it's not quite the same thing, because again, you expect more of the church. Nonetheless, who would stop playing rugby and who would stop watching rugby because of these kind of scandals? And the answer is no one, because they love the sport in itself and they believe in the sport in itself. So what they would want to do is, if there's a scandal in their club or there's a scandal higher up at the national level in the governing body, well, then they want to reform that and make sure it doesn't happen again and make sure whoever needs to be held accountable is held accountable. But because you still believe in rugby and still love rugby, you're not going to turn away from rugby. So if you love Christianity, if you believe in Christianity, if you believe in God, if you believe in Jesus and believe in being part of his community of followers, you're not going to abandon the church, are you, because of the scandals? In fact, it's going to, in a way, make you double down, because you're going to want to make it a better thing. And so I often make that kind of analogy.
So effectively what you're suggesting is that the abuse crisis, what it did was it actually just pulled the lid off a seething mess of unbelief, and people just, that was the sort of almost people, it became their get out of jail free card, if you like, but already underneath it there was a lack of belief. Is that what I'm hearing?
I think that's definitely part of it, because again, who abandons sport because of scandals? Maybe we stop watching the Olympics because we don't know what we're watching in 100 meters anymore, all right? But again, there's been scandals involving English Premier League football, but people haven't stopped watching English Premier League football, and they haven't stopped enrolling their children in football clubs and all this kind of thing, because they believe in the thing in itself. If people began to kind of stop believing in sport in itself, okay, well then the scandals would simply probably accelerate the drift away from sport, but that's not what happens, is it? So on to your question about the whole pro-life thing here. So back in 1983, Ireland introduced a pro-life amendment to the Constitution in a referendum of that year. And this protected the right to life. And anyway, there was huge moves from 1983 by those who were pro-choice to remove this amendment. It was passed, by the way, by a 2-to-1 majority, so a huge majority. So what happened in the period since, there were hard cases involving, for example, rape. And these women and sometimes girls were not allowed to have abortions in Ireland, so they go to England. And there was maybe 3,000 to 5,000 Irish women a year going to England for abortions, and this was seen as hypocritical on the part of Ireland. Why not allow them to have the abortions here? And then eventually this built up to a referendum in 2018, May of 2018, and the 1983 referendum was reversed by 2-to-1. So the first one was passed by 2-to-1, and this was reversed by 2-to-1. However, that constitution, without question, saved very many lives in Ireland, because our abortion rate, even allowing for those going to Britain, was far lower than what you see in New Zealand or Australia or Canada or America or Britain. Far lower. It was about 1 in 12 babies would be aborted, whereas I think in a place like New Zealand it's about 1 in 4, and certainly what it is across the Irish Sea in Britain, it's about 1 in 4. So much, much, much lower here. So that pro-life amendment saved probably tens of thousands of lives over the 35 years of its existence. And ironically, many of the young people who voted to remove that protection for the unborn may well be alive because of the pro-life amendment that they voted to be rid of. And the first full year of operation of the abortion law in Ireland saw the number of abortions taking place going up from roughly 5,000, and that's an upper estimate, to, and get this, the figure for 2019 was, so the first year of it being fully legal in Ireland, 6,666, 6666. So a kind of horribly symbolic kind of number. A few hundred still went to England for abortions because you can't get an abortion in Ireland for a disability-related reason. So the actual number was a bit over 7,000. So in a single year, the number of abortions in Ireland increased by at least 40%.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because Ireland, as a little petri dish, if you like, really disproved a lot of the pro-choice or pro-abortion myths about abortion. So one myth was that it doesn't matter what the law says, people are still going to have abortions. Well, clearly some people did go to England, but it still didn't actually account for the full gamut of what would have happened if it had been legal in Ireland. And secondly, the other claim was, well, the more restrictive your law is, the more pregnancy-related deaths, from backstreet abortion. So the maternal mortality rate should skyrocket. Now, Ireland should have been extremely high, but it was lower than places like the United States, which had a very liberal approach to abortion around the same time.
Yeah, I mean, our maternity hospitals have generally been extremely good places. There was this case a number of years ago, a very horrible case involving an Indian lady living here called Savita Halapanavar, and she came into hospital with sepsis. And the story was that she died because she was refused an abortion. There were several inquiries, and none of them came to that conclusion. There's sepsis-related deaths, in places like England every year among pregnant women. It's horrible, but it happens. And the existence of abortion doesn't save them. So Ireland's maternal death rate by Western standards was actually very low because, our obstetricians were doing a great job and they didn't need abortion to do a better job. And as you say, there's a higher maternal death rate in America. There's a higher maternal death rate, by the way, in England as well. It's often, poverty related and that kind of thing. But what Irish doctors became extremely skilled at was saving both the mother and the baby. And in some other countries, these skills are lost because abortion becomes the first resort in a difficult pregnancy. And so they resort to abortion and a healthy baby might be aborted. Whereas in Ireland, both mother and baby got saved in nearly every case when it was a difficult pregnancy.
What's the status for medical professionals over there who are pro-life? In New Zealand here, we've had a new piece of legislation, the Abortion Legislation Act, which was passed last March. It is one of the most extreme laws in the world, and deliberately and very targetedly, they went after the issue of freedom of conscience for medical professionals. And there's a huge irony in this because the new law they brought in, previously you had to get a referral from a GP, a doctor, to actually go and get an abortion. They took that out. And so now, if anyone wants an abortion, they can go directly to the abortion facility and seek it out themselves. They don't need a doctor, and yet they also ramped up the pressure on pro-life doctors and stripped away more of their conscience rights at the same time as they said you don't even need a doctor. So is that sort of situation evolving in Ireland as well, or not?
Well, a doctor doesn't have to perform an abortion, so he can say, or she can say no, and the nurse is the same. But if a woman comes to a doctor seeking an abortion, and what will normally happen is she'll go to a GP, because then she'll get given the abortion pill. So if the doctor says, no, I'm not going to do this, he has to refer, or she has to refer that woman to a doctor who will. So conscience rights are not, in fact, properly respected. They're only kind of half respected. And there's moves now to remove even that conscience protection, although I think it would result in a constitutional case. And hopefully the doctors on the pro-life side would win that case if it went to court.
You've got euthanasia on the table now, right? Is that correct? We've had that battle in New Zealand. We had a referendum that last year that was lost for those of us who care about keeping euthanasia illegal because of the harm that it does to vulnerable members of the community. So the referendum was lost. That came after a lengthy political battle, where also the majority of the parliament voted in favour of euthanasia. You've now got this issue on the table as well in Ireland, right?
We do, but I want to go back a step and ask you a question.
Sure.
So our abortion referendum was passed by 2-1. And I noticed your euthanasia referendum was passed by 2-1. Why was it so heavily passed?
Well, it's an interesting question, and there's a lot of, should we say, a lot of conversation has happened since from those of us on the side of opposition as to what happened and why did it happen. And I'll tell you why. What made this, I think, doubly frustrating was two things happened that we haven't really seen before in New Zealand. First of all, there was a massive coalition and a very big tent coalition in opposition. There were atheist groups. There were people who would have no bar at all for, say, the pro-life position on abortion, who were firmly committed and very public in their opposition to euthanasia. So this very big, broad tent movement of people from all over the place, all different sectors, all different ideologies and religious views, all came together to oppose it. That's the first time we've seen something like that, which is obviously going to make...
Were medical organisations mainly against?
Yes, there were absolutely. There were little splinter groups who formed who tried to be in favour, but they garnered very little support. So we had, there was a big push of groups and a community of people who were very vocal and very astute, and they made all the right arguments too, by the way, against it. They were very rational, very clear, and they presented the risk to the vulnerable as the primary concern here. So that's never happened before. So in theory, that should all work in your favour. Secondly, we also had, when it came to the referendum, we had one of the best, most well-financed, most well-researched and properly put together campaigns in opposition that's ever been run on any issue in this country. It really was, like, even down to the colours of the billboards, was independently focus group tested, and they really did it right, and still this result came. And I think there's an interesting question here that now plagues the West. Is this actually a fruit, or are we really finally starting to witness the fruit of a culture that has degraded to such a degree that even the best of political strategies is not enough anymore, because there's just not enough people who have a grasp on, say, the ethics, the fundamental ethics, or they're so mired in radical individualism they don't care, and they're more concerned about saving themselves from pain, if you like.
Oh, I think absolutely. I took part in a debate in one of our universities a couple of years ago, and I think our team did a pretty good job, laying out the arguments. We made it clear there is a slippery slope, and the pro-euthanasia side didn't really deny it. The grounds keep expanding, the numbers keep going up. We said pain can be managed. We said you're actually basically, legitimizing suicide under certain circumstances. You're devaluing the lives of people who have conditions like Parkinson's or MS. All of this was accepted by the audience, and it was basically accepted by the other side too. And still the students voted 2-1 in favour of euthanasia, because they just can't get over, this really hardcore belief. If I want this one day, I want to be able to choose this. And even if my choice makes somebody else feel devalued in their life because they're also suffering, and it might have a copycat effect, like suicide does, by the way, as a copycat effect. That's why reporting suicide has to be incredibly careful, because if it seems too sympathetic to the person's reason for killing themselves, it can have a copycat effect. And so all this was accepted, but the student body still voted 2-1 in favor, because I want that choice someday. And as you know, choice is now the absolute primary value. And there's not really any care about the kind of ripple effects of all this, although it does still get dressed up in the clothes of compassion. But what happened in New Zealand is interesting because, and obviously worrying, because on the abortion referendum here in 2018, lots of doctors were on the pro-choice side. And these kind of very high-profile doctors went on radio and television all the time arguing for abortion. We don't have to have a referendum on it this time in Ireland, by the way, because there's no protection in the Constitution for the old and infirm to defend themselves against assisted suicide. But I think actually, if there was a referendum like in New Zealand, the voices of doctors would not really count, even though nearly all doctors would be against, because I think the pro-choice ethic has gone right deep down into our DNA.
Do you know another fascinating thing that I observed was the way in which, even though the campaigning against this was consistently what I would call secular in nature, it made good, solid, natural law, ethical arguments, good, solid, pragmatic, evidence-based arguments around what's happened overseas and the harms that have resulted. Despite all of that, the proponents of this bill, the advocates of this new law, they still targeted Christianity and set themselves up as being in opposition to Christianity. And it was they who dragged that into the debate, not those who were in opposition. And so there was a fascinating, it was an interesting sign. I think anybody who's a watcher of culture, particularly if you have a religious faith, I think should have taken note of that. And you realize that in actual fact, they really do see themselves as being in opposition, not so much to an anti-euthanasia law, but really to the Christian beliefs about human dignity and the human person that lie behind that law.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it becomes progressively harder to defend the right to life if you think we're kind of an accidental product of evolution, doesn't it? Because if that's the case, then why are our lives intrinsically more valuable than that of anything else in the animal kingdom? Now, of course, there's some people say, well, that's exactly right. We're not intrinsically more valuable. But actually, if we're simply the products of blind evolution, nothing is intrinsically valuable. Nothing is value in itself, except the value we give it, which we can give it today and take away tomorrow. But as you were speaking, it was kind of occurring to me, abortion is quite widespread in Asia. I think it's legal in most Asian countries, but actually assisted suicide is not. I can't think of any Asian countries where assisted suicide is legal, not even in China. And I just wonder, what's going on there. Maybe it's still, respect for the elderly or something. So it is curious. You can actually have cultures which are, very pro-abortion, but they don't use the choice argument actually, because they're not individualistic cultures, but nonetheless haven't moved on to the next stage. But within our cultures, it looks like the ability to defend the right to life is very strongly attached to Christianity. And once it begins to disappear, the foundation for the entire right to life culture begins to crumble as well.
Yeah, I think too, there's that point you make. I think it points to something else that I've been talking about in public for a while now, is that the loss of authentic community in the West is a big driving factor here. And I think it happens in a couple of ways. The whole communal nature of family is broken down. It used to be extended family and even tribes of families, if you like. Now it's just me, if I've got a spouse, my spouse, and our kids. That's it. That's tender, and if you've got that, and then also the elderly, there's a tendency to sort of, in Western countries, I think the care home is the norm, not having an elderly parent in your home, which is the norm in most other countries. And then on top of that, I think when you think about the burden of the financial cost of care, and just trying to pay for a mortgage, keep two incomes going, and I would imagine that, it starts to look pretty attractive, euthanasia, when you've got no community around you, because it's you tell yourself it's about dignity and saving people from a horrible fate worse than death, but it's a lot easier at the end of the day, right? It does. If you've got no community around you, you're not supported, then they've had their time, they want to go, okay.
No, it becomes a very convenient kind of option, really. Obviously, the extended family was much better able to pitch in when somebody had got old and infirm and look after them. But nowadays, well, what do? Well, your elderly relative is probably living in a house on their own, once they get to a certain point, and they go into a nursing home, and the house that they used to be in is paying, at least in Ireland it does, is paying for their care in the nursing home. And people are kind of watching this and they're thinking, well, the value of my inheritance is dwindling away. I mean, I don't want to be overly cynical about this, but let's face it. And then a person who's in the nursing home begins to see, well, maybe I am, burdensome. They don't actually have to be told this. It's simply something that goes into the ether, so to speak. Well, maybe I am burdensome, and I see what other of my friends are doing. And when they get to a certain point in their life, they're opting for the injection. And children might be saying to them, well, ma'am, do you really want to continue to be a burden to yourself? All right. And all these things become horribly tempting because you end up with a kind of utilitarian ethic dressed up in the clothes of compassion. The same thing happens with abortion, by the way. Unfortunately, by the way, the same thing happened with the mother and baby homes, because a big driver of mother and baby homes in Ireland and elsewhere was very poor family. We can hardly afford to feed the mouths we've got. Now you're bringing another one onto the scene. We can't afford this. And so the mother gets shipped off to the mother and baby homes because it's just too burdensome for us to look after her here at home. She hasn't got a husband, she can't leave home, she can't go and set up her own house. So we're not going to have that. And the farm has to go anyway, unencumbered to the oldest son. There can't be anybody living in the house when he gets it, because he's going to want to get married himself. So I think there is a kind of ruthless utilitarian streak in human beings anyway, and always has been. But now what's been added to that is this kind of undermining of the right to life. And what strikes me about Ireland, and I find kind of galling, is we fancy we're more compassionate than those who brought in the mother and baby homes. And yet, what happens to the unwanted baby today? All right, before the child is born. And now what's going to happen to the unwanted elderly? I just don't see how this is compassion. In the name of choice, in the name of compassion, in the name of freedom, we begin to kill the unborn, the elderly, and the infirm.
We talked a moment ago about radical individualism, but interestingly enough, we've just come through now, we're into our second year of the COVID-19 pandemic, and I'd love to hear about the Irish experience, because here in New Zealand, we acted in the exact opposite way. Everyone said, you must lock down, you must stay home, your individualism and your individual choices are not more important than vulnerable people. We did the exact opposite to what we did on euthanasia just last year and on abortion just last year. Is this the fear factor at work here that's the difference? Has the Irish experience with COVID been similar?
Well, I think it's partly that faced with COVID, an elderly person says, I don't want to die from this, so my choice is not to die from this, therefore protect me, and therefore shut down society. But on the other hand, you have some terrible disease and I don't want to live with this and I want to die, so therefore offer me assisted suicide. So you can actually square it with a pro-choice ethic, even though if you really, really believe in choice, then you shouldn't really go into a full lockdown, should you? You should make it voluntary, your behavior, even if it has this wider effect upon society and public health. If we really, really believe in the pro-choice ethic, you'd go all the way out to this kind of libertarian position. In Ireland, our kind of death rate is somewhat lower, I think, than the European average. It's not because we've done a fantastic job, it's because we're a small island, sparsely populated on the edge of Europe. We're not like Belgium. Belgium and the Czech Republic have both had the highest death rates, I think, in the world, by the way. And because they're both basically landlocked countries, surrounded on all sides by other countries. I mean, Belgium has a coast, very long border with France, very long border with Germany and so on, Netherlands, very densely populated. If you took New Zealand and Jacinda Ardern and you plonked New Zealand and your Prime Minister into the space Belgium occupies, there is absolutely zero chance that zero COVID would have been achieved. Absolutely none whatsoever. And it is extremely unlikely the death toll, unless the nursing homes were protected, would have been that different in Belgium had Jacinda Ardern been in charge. I mean, your geography has been hugely advantageous to New Zealand and to Australia, and has been somewhat advantageous to Ireland Although obviously we have a giant neighbour like Britain right alongside us with 66 million people and lots and lots and lots of travel between the two of them. And we're beside a continent of 440 million people. So, geography, I think, has a huge, huge, huge amount to do with this.
What's the impact been as far as legislation and policy response to COVID? Have you had lockdowns? Have you had restrictions? How has that been received or pushed back against, if you like, within Irish society?
Yeah, so we went into our first lockdown nearly a year ago. We're now in our third lockdown. You do get people here saying we should copy New Zealand and basically seal the borders, and then stay locked down for a few months. And if we keep the borders sealed and we quarantine everybody coming in for 2 weeks in a hotel, we can keep it at zero. So there is that voice out there, and there's other people say impossible to achieve zero COVID in Ireland. We've a border with Northern Ireland. It's part of the UK. It's not going to lock down. It's too easy to get back and forth over the border. You're never going to be able to stop it. So zero COVID is an impossibility for Ireland. But yeah, we're in a lockdown for the third time. It's been in place since just after Christmas because we had a big spike over Christmas. A lot of people began to disobey the rules. There was a relaxation of the rules coming up for Christmas as well. So for a little while after Christmas, we had the highest case rate per head of population in the world.
Wow.
And it's come right back down again because we've had a lockdown ever since. And by the way, you can't attend public worship in Ireland. It's been stopped again since Christmas. I think for about 8 of the last 12 months, you can't go to Mass. Within the European Union, there's only 2 other countries where you can't go to Mass, and that's Slovenia and Slovakia, and then the third one being Ireland. Everywhere else in the European Union, you can go to Mass or church or synagogue or mosque. There's big restrictions on numbers who can attend, and you need social distancing and hand sanitizing and all that kind of thing. But Ireland has been incredibly strict, and there hasn't been much pushback against it because I think people are really terrified of COVID. To my mind, they're actually overly scared. I think they believe the predictions that were made in the early days that Ireland is about the same population as New Zealand, about 5 million people. And there were predictions that between 80 and 120,000 people could die, which would be just an incredibly high number. I mean, Britain has had about 120,000 deaths, but it is 66 million people. We have 5 million people. So they were talking about deaths here in a part of Britain with 15 times our population. So I never believed that. But a lot of people did believe it and still do believe it. And we have a media that kind of feeds the fear. And so there hasn't been the kind of resistance to lockdown you've seen in some other European countries.
Do you worry about this as a sort of threat to stable governance? And what I mean by that is that there's a lot of people, well, not a lot of people, there's a large and very loud minority that seems to be consistent around the world who are saying that they think that we're normalizing an approach to things that is actually too draconian. It's a threat to good ethical governance. There's too much overreach going on. Does that concern you, or do you think that as this crisis abates, that so will these regulations?
Well, I think a lot of them will, yes. But there's a fellow in Britain, he's a former Supreme Court Justice called Jonathan Sumption. And he is regarded as one of Britain's leading public intellectuals. And he's given some great interviews about this. And he is concerned that he said, to preserve freedom, a society needs to have conventions of freedom. And conventions, not those laws that respect individual liberty. And he worries that in the name of public health, we've been so willing to give up so many of our individual liberties. He thinks it was justifiable in the first lockdown because we didn't quite know how bad this thing was going to be. But he now thinks it's increasingly less justifiable. Because, I mean, on a scale of 1 to 10, if the Black Death is a 10, it killed about between a third and 40% of the European population in the 1340s. This thing is more like maybe a 0.1 or 1, right? But we're going on like it is actually the Black Death. And it's right up there in the very, very worst types of pandemics the world has ever seen. And so he's kind of thinking, if we take away liberty so quickly in the name of public health, but then he worries that it will become too easy to do it again in the future. And, the cherished liberties we fought so hard for, we'll just get too quick to sacrifice. But he's been quite a lone voice in Britain, even though it's a very big country. There haven't been too many saying that kind of thing. I mean, my own position has been kind of like an in-between kind of one. I'm not somebody who says we should have no restrictions. That would just be insane. But I've always argued they need to be proportionate. They can't be greater than what's needed. You can't live in a zero-risk society. I mean, I don't know what's going to happen in the end in New Zealand. When do you open your borders again? Because even if you vaccinate a lot of your population, you're going to end up opening your borders into a world that has not gone zero COVID and in which there are variants. So your day of reckoning, even with vaccines, is going to come someday. You can't remain a hermit kingdom forever. All right, you can't live in a zero-risk world forever. And so what are New Zealanders ultimately going to decide? Because what I notice in Britain, the more vaccines they've got, the more scared they've got. Because they're terrified, and they have a very successful vaccination program there, much more successful than in the rest of the Europe. Well, it's not in the European Union, but in the rest of the European Union, they have much fewer people vaccinated. But now that Britain is successfully vaccinating its people, they've become terrified of variants. And they're getting stricter about travel, not less strict in case some variant unravels the whole thing. So you might find with New Zealand, you begin to roll out the vaccine, and next minute Jacinda is saying, well, we got to keep the drawbridge pulled up in case some variant gets in. Yeah, so when do you pull down the drawbridge?
Yeah, and that's always been my fear, is that basically there's a technocracy, a creeping technocracy here. And effectively, it all relies on one very important thing. They have to actually succeed. And if they don't succeed in elimination, I mean, across the board, like you say, globally, then guess what? You have to keep, and I guess it's the sunk cost fallacy, you know. Well, I've already put this much into it. We've got to keep going with the restrictions, and we'll put more restrictions on, and that'll make it better. And you become so blind that actually isn't a way forward. And so that's always been my concern, that you might never get your way out of this rabbit hole if you go too far down it.
Have you ever come across a guy called Ivan Ilyich?
I've heard of.
Yeah, he was, kind of a public intellectual in his day, as famous as Jordan Peterson would be today, and that was mainly in the 1970s. And he was an Austrian philosopher and priest. He was a highly eccentric individual, probably slightly mad, but also one of these kind of completely brilliant people. He warned in the 1960s that one day a public health emergency would come along, and we would give doctors the same power that generals have in war. And he thought that they were just going to be given completely disproportionate power in the name of public health. And he said all other goods and considerations in society would completely fall by the wayside. And he would see what's happened here in the West and elsewhere in the last year as the complete fulfillment of his prophecy.
It's that creeping utilitarianism, right? It's that same issue, it seems to me. And also you combine that with a culture that's increasingly secular, does not have an eternal perspective on anything. It's all about the here and now. So we've got to hold on to this for grim death, because that's all we've got. And it creates the worst of sort of combinations, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if you've noticed that in Florida, the governor in September, on the 1st of September, said, we're never going into lockdown again. We will have restrictions, we will have social distancing and limits on numbers that can go in somewhere, but we're not going into lockdown again. And this was considered to be an insane idea. California has had lockdown. So here we are now, it's well into March, and you can compare California, big state, big population, Florida, big state, somewhat smaller population, but still one of the most populous states in America, but an older population because so many retired people live in Florida, and their death rate is roughly the same as Florida's. We just had multiple lockdowns, California has had multiple lockdowns. Florida has had no lockdown since September, and their death rates are about the same. So, I mean, when you're comparing any two countries, there's so many variables, and it's difficult to do one-for-one comparisons. Nonetheless, the Florida example is really interesting, and they did a good job, by the way, protecting the nursing homes. A place like New York did an absolutely terrible job. So did Ireland, by the way. We did a terrible job in the early stages protecting the nursing homes, and that was one of the things that kind of drove up the death rate here. About half of all deaths have been in nursing homes.
Well, in regard to defeating COVID, as my old dad used to say, there's more than one way to skin a cat. I don't know why we've stopped believing that with COVID, because I think there's more than just lockdowns, it seems, but we don't even want to consider that. Now, we've talked about the virus of COVID. Both of our countries have been affected by it. The virus of wokeism. Is Ireland in the grip of a woke revolution? What's going on, or is that sort of stoic, salt of the earth type Irishman sort of holding his own against it? What's happening in Ireland?
We're pretty woke because you see, remember, we're reacting against Catholicism. We've dumped it, so we're looking for a new type of piety, and the new type of piety is wokeism. So you'll find the universities are absolutely saturated in all the stuff. Cancel culture operates in our universities, but it operates in a kind of like pre-cancellation mode. So what I mean by that is you don't ever cancel people because they don't even get invited. Okay, certain topics simply won't be debated in advance. The odd person manages to somehow slip through the filter. So there was a case here in Ireland last year. Last year. The oldest student debating society in Ireland, I think in the world, is at Trinity College Dublin. Edmund Burke, the famous conservative philosopher.
Great Edmund Burke.
I think he was a founding member. Anyway, so they called it Historical Society or simply the HIST. So a new committee came in last year to this debating society, and they looked at the agenda and schedule of speakers. And they discovered this new committee, to their horror, one of the speakers was Richard Dawkins. Now, you and I wouldn't be fans of Richard Dawkins, right? I mean, arch-atheist, always attacking our religion, thinks we're a bunch of morons, suffer from a God delusion, all this kind of thing. And he's pro-abortion, and he's pro-aborting, Down syndrome babies, and he's pro-assisted suicide, so he ticks many of these boxes. Nonetheless, he's hypercritical of Islam, which I think he's called the most evil religion in the world, and Catholicism is the second most evil. So anyway, the committee, the newly elected committee of the HIST in Trinity, can't have him. So he got cancelled. So I found myself in the weird position as this kind of Catholic commentator who has debated Dawkins, coming out in his defense and saying, hang on a minute, you can't be cancelling him just because he's insulted Islam, you don't like him. But they did cancel him, and there's been a few other examples like that, but they don't have to do much cancelling because all the pre-cancelling has happened. The Historical Society, this debating club at Trinity, it doesn't really have debates anymore. It has kind of in-house left-wing discussions about feminism and fashion, this kind of stuff.
It's funny. I was going to ask for your take on wokeism because but you've preempted already, because I see it like you as a desperate grasping for religious truth from a culture that has abandoned Christianity. I think it was Chesterton who once said, when man stops believing in God, he doesn't believe nothing, he'll believe anything. And to me, it's that vacuum that exists within all of us. They're desperately trying to fill that with some sort of ethical framework. You've interviewed some of the new atheists, Richard Dawkins, Christopher Hitchens. You've debated them. Do you think new atheism, which is now actually under the gun with woke culture, they're targets just as much as the rest of us are, but do you think that they actually helped to seed the ground a little bit, that they were so hostile, if you like, to Christianity, they ridiculed it to such a degree that it seeded the ground a little bit for what came next?
I think a little bit, but I wouldn't want to exaggerate it, because I found something a bit strange over the last couple of years. I find myself increasingly in agreement with some of these new atheists, like Dawkins, like Sam Harris. There's a guy called Gad Saad, S-A-A-D, who's a Canadian Lebanese guy. He's an atheist. Ricky Gervais, for goodness sake. He couldn't be more insulting about religion. But all these guys have turned their guns on wokeism. And so I find myself sometimes kind of not in agreement with these guys, some of whom, again, I've debated. Because I think they've realized we got a new religion here, folks. All right. I mean, why were we attacking Christianity so strongly? Because actually, here's the thing that's really, taken over as the new conformism and orthodoxy. And you see, you still hear people in Ireland, in my age and younger, oh, we grew up with all this Catholic guilt. And I'm thinking, I didn't. I mean, I grew up in the 70s mainly. I mean, I just never came across this Catholic guilt. To anybody younger, they're just talking through their hat. But what about woke guilt? I mean, you're supposed to see racism everywhere. And we're guilty of racism down to the last fiber of our being. And we're guilty of Islamophobia and sexism and all these other phobias, right? And we've got to be constantly examining our consciences and going to these unconscious bias training sessions, all right? Because we're sinning, right, down, to the last level of our being all the time, even when we're not aware of it. So we don't even have the excuse in the Catholic theology of invincible ignorance, do we? Okay?
That was the irony, right? With Catholic guilt, at least the principle was sound. The principle was, if you're doing something immoral, you should be guilty about it. With woke guilt, it's like, no, you are guilty just because of who you are. And even if you don't know you're guilty, you're still guilty.
And also, Christianity says you can get forgiven, and also you don't have to be perfect. All right. I mean, here's where the whole doctrine of the atonement and the cross comes in. Somebody else will pay, the penalty for your imperfections. But there's nothing like that within woke theology. There's nobody can come along and cancel all the debts. All right. So you've got to be in a state, if you're considered to be one of the oppressor groups, in a state of constant abasement and constant self-examination and constant groveling. And this has got to go on for generations. And you're guilty of things that happened generations ago because you're the beneficiary of all these inherited privileges. And then those who are, in the lower ladders of the social ladder, they are there because they are the victims of past oppression by your ancestors. So even though you're not directly guilty, you're the one who's got to make up for it. So a minor example is gender quotas. All right. Well, you might deserve that promotion, but you're not going to get it. Because probably the reason you're in a position to get that promotion is because you're a man and you've benefited from men who came before you who pushed women out of the way. And so now in this generation, you've got to move out of the way to let women up the corporate ladder. Now, my response to that is, if you're a man and you believe in gender quotas and you're in a senior position, volunteer for a demotion. And certainly if you're a guy who's middle-aged and older in a senior position, don't inflict your support for gender quotas on the men coming up the ladder after you. You move aside and let a woman take up your position, all right? So the people who believe in all this stuff need to lead by example, and they almost never do. Can you ever think of a single woke male giving up a position of seniority? I mean, if you take Joe Biden, white male, no white male should run for a position in the Democratic Party, if you believe in woke doctrine, for about the next 200 years, right? So, I mean, Kamala Harris should have been the candidate, full stop. Although, mind you, she's a descendant of the Brahmin caste in India, or at least in Sri Lanka. So, is she not the beneficiary of inherited privilege as well? But if you do believe in this stuff, you've got to move aside, okay? You've just got to move aside. You've got to lead by example. So the Democratic Party should not have a white leader, certainly no male leaders, for about 2 centuries.
What is the cure? Do you think, because I look at it and I think, do we get out of this phase alive, or does the thing, society as we know it have to collapse in a sense before we realize what we actually lost and gave away? So I think about things like freedom of expression, which has just been eroded left, right and center. I think about this confusion around human identity and the critical theory and how that's being imposed. It seems to me that it's becoming so entrenched that it may have to actually implode it on itself before we get out of it, because is there enough of a critical mass now to push back against us and pull society free?
Yeah, I mean, all ideas burn out in the end, but it can cause huge destruction along the way and burn society out in the process too. I mean, this will end. It could end with a huge rebellion, by the way. I mean, look again at the kind of authoritarian version of Catholicism we had in this country. People were silent, and then one day they all spoke out. And it all ended then very quickly. And so I think there's a lot of people quietly kind of sick of the whole thing, and they're sick of the fact they can't speak their mind, and you get in trouble for nearly anything, and you can get your career cancelled for something you said that was stupid from 20 years ago. And I think at the moment there's a kind of reign of terror about all this, but I think a lot of people are kind of making mental notes, and they're getting sick of it. And I think Brexit was a kind of manifestation of that. And I think Trump in his own mad way was a kind of manifestation of that as well. And I think, all of a sudden, out of nowhere, you might suddenly get a rebellion, and demolish practically overnight. But if it doesn't, it's just going to burn out Western societies. But I think, ultimately, if that's what happens, well, then we just say Western societies have had their day, and now something else is going to appear in the scene. and take his place. And I think what might happen in a place like Ireland is Christians will come in from countries like Philippines and Nigeria, other parts of Africa, and if that happens, well, good on them, all right? Because I'd welcome if Ireland became a very multi-ethnic place, but more Christian again.
Yeah, I'm the same as you, which leads me, I guess, to the final question, the million-dollar question. David, what do you think the Christian church can do to better respond in this age we now find ourselves living in? There's all these theories floating around. I think, there's merit in different ones. There's not so much merit in others. But what do you think is a reasonable way for us to move through this phase right now?
Yeah, well, there's no easy answer. It's going to come from very hard work. The sort of work you do, by the way, which is kind of trying to give people reasons to believe, working in small groups or bigger groups, as the case may be, doing programs like this, teaching people how to kind of resist woke doctrine. I think what people like Rod Dreher says, kind of benefit option of small Christian communities. I think one-on-one evangelization. I think. I remember speaking to this person. He's an American, and he admitted that he's a priest. He admitted in his parish, the person who brought in more converts and resulted in more baptisms than anybody else in his parish was the guy in charge of the choir. Because what happened? People are attracted to beauty, all right, and so they join the choir, and then they get to know other people, and then they say, "Oh, hey, I like this place. And what's this faith all about?" And they get baptized through this kind of one-on-one contact and attraction to beauty. So I think the one-on-one thing can't be underestimated. I think we've kind of given up one-to-one evangelization. It's difficult to do. You don't want to be called a holy Joe, even though people don't mind being called kind of virtue signalers, and they're doing it all the time. But there's still a kind of dread of being overly pious and ramming your religion down people's throats. But there's a lot of quiet work to be done. Parishes, like in Ireland anyway, they do practically no evangelization. They don't even drop leaflets into households saying children's mass at 10 o'clock every Sunday. They don't invite back parents who children got baptized a year ago or couples who got married a year ago. So there's a lot of small things can be done that could have incremental effects. And I also think we've got to realize if you're in certain jobs, you may have to suffer for what you believe. You may have to risk not being promoted. You may have to risk being demoted. We become very soft as well. We think suffering shouldn't be part of life, which is just ridiculous. So we have to be prepared, I think, to make certain sacrifices as well for what we believe and speak out in the public arena, because not enough of us are doing that, in my opinion, including, by the way, bishops.
Well, I think you've summed things up perfectly there, David. And it's great to have you on the show to have this conversation. I'm especially a real Irishman. I've got Irish heritage. My family came here from Ireland, and I'm very proud of that fact. But to have a real Irishman, I've climbed a whole another step up the ladder now. So I really appreciate you taking the time. It's been really great to have the conversation.
Thank you.
When we wake, hear the birds and see the sun. Side by side our fears are done. All the good times just begun. We know what we have, let's hold on tight. Found what we're looking for in life. Call us crazy, but things are finally right. With you and I, the future is bright.